Good morning, everyone. My name is Zachary Brooks, and today is my dissertation defense. The title is Bilingual Decision Making. I'm a PhD student, now candidate in second language acquisition with concentrations in cognitive science and management. And those three things, second language acquisition, cognitive science, and management, are really reflected in today's dissertation defense. Today is April 7th, 2016. And the title, I don't think I said that yet, is Bilingual Decision Making. Verbal Probability, Ethics, and Cognition. So first of all, my goal when I came to University of Arizona to the second language acquisition and teaching program was to apply applied linguistics. So I just finished my master's at University of Massachusetts, Boston, and I really loved the field. And I really thought that the field actually had so much more to offer than just looking at pedagogy in the classroom of teaching and learning. As important as those things are, I thought, wow, there's just so many great things about this field that could be applied elsewhere. So two examples that come to mind are in marketing, for example. So marketing people do a lot of sentiment analysis. And they do that by tagging words and basically creating databases of words and looking for words and patterns and try to get a sentiment of people's behaviors and feelings about various products and services and so forth. And that's a lot of what applied linguistics has been doing, is looking at how people interact with things. And the second thing, and maybe more relevant, is in the world of hospital communications. So I looked up, I did a Google search, and since 2010, there's been about 300,000 articles published on healthcare communication, just with those words. I didn't make the search too complex. And within applied linguistics, we've been looking at these things for a long time, so why not apply them to other fields? So that was sort of my big motivation. But then after I kind of go through that phase of thinking, I thought, well, it's not really enough just to identify a problem. I really had to become an agent of change. And so while I've been here at University of Arizona, I've studied mostly cognitive science and psychology. And I thought if I can learn a lot from those fields and then bring them back to applied linguistics, I would be doing myself and perhaps the field a service, which is to try to apply applied linguistics to other domains, which I think it really should be. So this has been a lot of my motivation while at University of Arizona. But lots of things in life, as you kind of know, happen through chance occurrences. And so I didn't decide to study bilingual decision making at the outset. In fact, I was taking my courses in cognitive science. I was nearly finished with my minor in cognitive science, and I was with Dr. Janet Nickel in her office talking about how many courses I needed to finish up in cognitive science. And I had one more to do, and we had a nice conversation. And as I was standing up, she said, well, why don't you take this seminar with Massimo Piatelli Palmerini? He teaches a judgment and decision-making seminar. And my thought process at that moment was like, great, get it out of the way. And that's really where I was. And fast forward a few months, so to the next semester, to the fall semester, I found myself in this seminar on judgment and decision making. And I was extremely fascinated with it. I mean, one, people have been studying judgments and decision making for many years and seeing how humans make good decisions and how humans make bad decisions. And Sean Nichols' work was really fascinating. He came to class, and Terry Connolly, and I remember Chris Robertson sitting in the back of the rafters saying lots of smart things. And I was fascinated with it. I was still just going to finish a course, but then this obnoxious habit that lots of people have who study applied linguistics or second language acquisition, a lot of this obnoxious habit is to always ask, well, what would a second language speaker do? Because we always sort of see the world through that dimension, because maybe people would behave differently. Maybe they would, maybe they wouldn't. And so then I thought, well, if I'm going to continue to go and study these things, you know, I should really start taking some more classes on this. And so I signed up for Terry Connolly's Judgment and Decision-Making course. And with the basic question, which I put up here on the slide, is I wondered, would second language speakers make the same decision in the same experiments? And I thought, you know, whatever happens, I'm going to have three outcomes, and all of those I could live with. One is I would find absolutely nothing. But at least that would confirm previous paradigm and tests and other decision-making realms, and I thought that would be okay. You know, not the best, 2, I would find some nuances that would show that there are some second language making differences. I thought at the very least that would be a pretty good outcome as well. Of course, the best outcome of all would be I find some major difference between first and second language speakers. And when I took Terry Connolly's class in decision making, I started doing a pilot test, and I found some things early on which sort of prompted me to go further. Initially, it was just, let me just take a course and explore this a little bit further. So with that, I'll launch into the first of my 3, with that, I'll almost launch into my first of my 3 papers I did. So altogether, I see this whole thing as a proof of concept, meaning it was nice to do a small test with Terry Connolly in that class, but I thought, if I just find a few differences here with one study of 30 people, that's not really going to tell me much. And so I decided I would do a lot more, and I felt compelled to study this question: do second language speakers make different decisions in the same test than first language speakers? I decided I was going to study this in 3 domains. Altogether, I did 3 studies, 18 experiments. I have an estimated of 2,000 people who participated, so 800 people who speak English as a first language and 1,200 people who speak English as a second language. That's mostly Chinese and native Arabic speakers. I got, most of my subjects came from CECIL, which is here at University of Arizona, so Center for English as a Second Language, and from composition courses where first language speakers of English and second language speakers of English both learn how to write in these basic freshman level composition courses. I collected age and gender data, but a lot of my data is anonymous. So that's why it's hard to estimate exactly how many participants I had, because some of these participants participated in more than 1 or 2 experiments. So it's an estimate, but I think it's pretty close to 2,000 people altogether who participated in this experiment. And again, the reason I was doing that is to get, if I found anything at all, I wanted that finding to be something I could really stand on, not just sort of glance at and say, oh, that's really nice, and then make grandiose statements based on a small set of data. I really wanted to have a lot of data. So with that, I will start my first slide. So in University of Arizona SLAT program, we have the option of doing a 3-paper dissertation option. So the traditional monograph is something I considered, which is just a very long paper, or we have the 3-paper option, so you write individual papers and then kind of put them together. So that's what I did. So the first of my studies is on verbal probabilities. So basically words as numbers. And the reason I chose this is because as a person who's taught English as a second language, I thought this was a sort of a familiar concept, teaching words like always, sometimes, never. So I'll start into this. So words as numbers. He probably needs surgery. So probability can be expressed numerically, 75%, 33%, 12%, etc. Or verbally, probably, rare, seldom, those kind of words. And like I said just a second ago, these words are reminding me a lot of teaching adverbs of frequency when you teach people to speak English. So always means 100%, sometimes is 50%, and never is 0%. So I thought this would have worked for me as a thing to study. And verbal probability expressions are preferred for many reasons. One is because they're pretty easy to use. People have been using them a lot longer than they have been using numbers to express probability. 2, they express a wider range of possibilities. And the third reason is that there's not really any costs to the decision maker when they decide to use verbal probability to make a decision versus a numerical statement. So what I did is I searched around and I found a meta-analysis by Thiel 2002, and he studied a lot of verbal probability expression studies since the late 60s. That's the earliest ones I saw. And people in management, United Nations, those kind of people have studied this for a long time because they really wanted to know not only the outcome of words used, so if you use rare, what's the outcome for that, but also how to communicate risk and danger of the environment going sour, whatever it is, through these words. So it's been studied a long time. And the most frequently, I assume the most frequently studied verbal probability expressions were rare, very unlikely, unlikely, possible, likely, probable, good chance, frequent, usually, and very probable. There's many, many, many verbal probability expressions, but I thought 10 would be a good place to start. So what I have is students participated in surveys. That's the way that they did the research with me and for me. I used Qualtrics as the data collection instrument, so I had the University of Arizona account and used that. Subjects answered all the questions. They had forced responses, so if they wanted to proceed to the next window within the survey, they had to answer the question. Once they got to the next window, they couldn't go back and change. And finally, they saw all answers at once. And so they saw individual sentences, which I'll show in a minute, and then they made choices like that. Now, there's various ways you can do this. I chose all answers at once. Altogether, let me get back to my slide here. Altogether, I had 180 people participate in this first experiment. So 33 first language speakers of English and 147 second language speakers of English. Portuguese, Arabic, Spanish, and Chinese were pretty well represented, and this was very nice. This was a summer at Cecil when they had lots of people from Brazil and Mexico as well, and they always have a high population of Chinese and Arabic speakers. So it was a pretty good population of people to sample from. So here's my basic hypothesis. And at this point, when I created the hypothesis, I looked around a lot of the studies that had been done previously. No one had really looked at if there's a difference between first and second language speakers. And I had a little pilot study, which I had done in this class I mentioned, judgment decision-making class. And I had some idea that there were going to be differences, but it was only 30 people. But that's really where my hypothesis came from. So a basic two-tailed hypothesis, which is there are differences between L1 and L2 speakers' numerical assessments of 10 verbal probability expressions. So I didn't know the difference, had no idea, but I just figured there would be a difference. And the first experiment, I did 3 experiments here. What the subject saw is if it is rare for Sam to log into Facebook, how many times per day does Sam log into Facebook? And then this rare was replaced with different words, rare, very unlikely, probable, those kind of things. And the subjects were told write a number between 0 and 100. So that's what they were asked to do, the basic setup there. And here are the differences. So what I found is that in every single case, second language speakers on average gave higher verbal probability assessments than first language speakers. And that really surprised me, not to have it that strong and in every single case. I ran some additional tests, some t-tests in this case, and I found that only 2 of these were significantly different, so rare and very unlikely. But still, the directional differences were very surprising, that in every single case of these 10 words, students, participants, gave higher verbal probability assessments, so higher numbers. And what I did is I used a guy named Ham, 1991. He asked people out loud, gave them a sentence, put a blank in the sentence, and they had to respond. He would say out loud, if it's rare to do X, Y, and Z, what number would you give me? If it's very likely X, Y, and Z, what number would you give me? So I took that stimulus and I just did it in a written form. So they saw the sentence, saw the word, and they had to give a number. I did a second experiment, very similar setup. In this case, it was the monthly event. The other one was a daily event. So if it's rare for Sandra to go jogging, how many times per month does Sandra go jogging? That was the basic stimulus. And you can see once again, they chose between 0 and 100 for any of these words. And the results, once again, are very similar. So in every single case, the directional differences show that second language speakers, on average, give higher numbers than first language speakers. And of these differences, 2 were significantly different. Now, I was surprised that rare was not significantly different, but already with 2 experiments, I see that the only things that are significantly different are on the lower end of the spectrum, rare, very unlikely, and unlikely. So that was kind of a surprise. Now, at this point, you might have seen an imperfection in the design of this study. And I realized it about halfway through. And if you didn't see it, I'll point it out right now. So I'll go back a slide. And here, subjects were given 0 to 100 for a monthly event. Well, months have around 30 days. And so it might be strange to put in a number higher than 30 for 30 days, but they had that option. And I didn't really take out too many outliers. The only people I really took out, the only data I really took out is if someone listed 100 for every single possibility. That's the only time I really took anything out. The rest of the time I just let it stand. And I realized this about halfway through, and I thought, well, since first and second language speakers are both seeing the same materials, even if it's imperfect, I can at least compare it to the same thing. But I did want to improve on my design. So my third experiment, my second experiment, the third overall, I had 64 first language speakers of English. These are mostly college students here at University of Arizona, and 124 non-native speakers. So quite a few Arabic and quite a few Chinese. And this is kind of the pattern we get at University of Arizona. These are the biggest groups of non-native speakers who come to our campuses. And here, very similar setup. If it is rare for sender to take tests, how many days per month does sender take tests? And then I gave subjects choices. So 0 days, 2, 4, 6, the rest of it. And I chose 30 days. I know there's some days of months that have 28 or 29 days. Some are 31, but I thought 30 days was a good amount. In this way, I restricted their choices. I didn't have to worry about things. And since this is a slightly better design, I could compare the results of this to the design earlier, which had some imperfections. And what I found was something very, very similar. Once again, that in this case, 9 out of 10 of the cases, second language speakers gave higher verbal probability assessments than first language speakers. Now you can notice the differences are much smaller, but they were restricted to a smaller numbers as well. So that's not really something that concerns me. Of these, only one is significantly different, which is rare. So what I found so far in these three things, and I'll summarize in a second, is that when there are significant differences, they're at the lower end of the spectrum. I also did a repeated measures examination. So I had English and Chinese. So 16 native Chinese speakers took this this test in Chinese and in English. I had it translated by 3 native Chinese speakers. One's a PhD student in linguistics, one's a PhD student in applied linguistics, or SLAT, second language acquisition, and the other one was an undergraduate. I think she was studying communication. So I had good Chinese speakers translate this. So same thing here. I had 9 native English speakers, those mostly freshmen, and these are sophomores and juniors taking 300 and 400 level Spanish courses. 9 of them participated both in the Spanish version and the English version. And I also had various people, English speakers, participate both in English and in English 28 days later. And all of these were actually 28 days later. I was able to control for that. I got lucky with scheduling, basically. But in all these cases, it was exactly 28 days later between taking the English version and then the non-English version. And everything is the same here. I'll start with these on the bottom and work my way top. So in English and English, there was no significant differences between how they participated, or their assessments in English or in English the second time around, meaning their answers were consistent. Same thing for the English speakers who did it also in Spanish. There was no significant differences, meaning whatever language they were presented with, their answers were pretty much the same. In this case, no significant differences. And with the Chinese, there was only one thing that popped out. The word good chance popped out as being different. And even though I had this translated by 3 native speakers, and I checked with them later, they all said they translated to a word that was very similar to occasionally. So I thought it was strange, but then if you translate word for word Chinese, good chance also means good luck. So perhaps there was a translation thing going on. That's really my only explanation as to why this one word, good chance, popped out as different. Otherwise, the Chinese speakers, when they did it in Chinese or in English, basically gave me the same response, meaning no significant differences between one language and the other. So it was kind of an interesting result. And so what I have for results and implications are this. three words, rare, very unlikely, and unlikely, were significant. And it's partial confirmation of the hypothesis. The hypothesis was that there would be a difference. One implication of this is that if second language speakers provide higher estimates than their first language counterparts for these three words, rare, very unlikely, and unlikely, then L2 speakers may take fewer risks, as they may overestimate the risks compared to their L1 counterparts. They see this word has a numerical probability attached to it, and when they're using that word to assess a situation, maybe they would assess risk differently. And maybe that's not a negative thing. If you overestimate it, maybe you give yourself more chance. You give yourself more chances to be correct, or at least not be wrong. So, second study I did, ethics, things people do. Ethics, things people do. Things people do and how we judge those actions. So I'll just start off with a stimulus and let it float there for a minute, and I'll talk about it in a little bit. What should you do? What would you do in a situation where you see yourself as this person? You have a train. We can go on one track or the other track. I'll come back to that in a second. So the second group of studies I did had to do with ethical decision making. So what would you do in a situation? And all of these ethical decision making studies, they push participants to make hard choices about various things. So in this one, the trolley problem, participants have to choose between utilitarian choices and deontological. So utilitarian are ends justify means, and deontological are very much principle-based type things. For example, man shall not kill. So I would never, ever kill no matter what the situation, versus, if it were a really bad situation, maybe there is a better thing to do. Maybe I do have to do something that's more or less negative. Other ethical decision-making studies, such as the public goods game, they ask and they tease out pro-social versus more selfish behavior, or in this case, free rider behavior. And public goods game is literally that. Do you give money to the pot, which is for the public, or do you keep it for yourself? And the incentives in the game are both built in, that either choice makes sense. Which choice plays out to be a better choice in the end is very different. Another set of studies, prisoner's dilemma. So you have two prisoners, and do they cooperate, or does one rat out the other? And that tests out cooperative and non-cooperative behavior. Fourth one, ultimatum game, is about a game of making offers. And so do you have different proposal or rejection behaviors between first and second language speakers? And finally, a little bit different study, and this is the first time I've known that this study was actually put together for first and second language speakers, is this thing called the Nobel effect. So how do we attribute responsibility of choices that have both positive and negative outcomes? So someone might make a choice to build a bridge and it has a negative outcome or a positive outcome. How does someone judge that first decision based on the outcomes? So this is also called, the Nobel effect is also called the side effect effect. This paper that I wrote is around 102 pages, so I'm not going to be presenting data on 102 pages worth of stuff. I'll be focusing really on just one, which is going to be just the trolley problem, and that's enough. I did 4 experiments there anyway. I have lots of data on the other things, but I talked to Sean in philosophy, and we agreed the most interesting data I have, and the thing that is most likely to be really publishable very soon, are the things from the trolley problem. So again, students participated in surveys. I used Qualtrics to collect data. Subjects answered all the questions. They had forced responses, so they had to respond before proceeding. Once they got to the next screen, though, they couldn't go back and change. So some basic similarities from the first experiment as far as data collection. I had, in this case, 278 people participate, 83 first language speakers of English and 147 non-native speakers, quite a few Chinese and Arabic, and some native speakers of Spanish as well participated in this first experiment. So experiment 1. So a thought experiment, trolley problem is a thought experiment. And a thought experiment basically forces people to deal with something. So a lot of people say they would never, ever do anything no matter what the situation. But that's what you say you would do, but what would you really do if forced in that situation? Now, thought experiment's not the real thing, but philosophers and experimental people who study ethics have been studying this quite a bit. And so I use the trolley problem because it's been studied quite a bit. The trolley problem, Foote and Thompson, is a thought experiment to test how people behave under hypothetical ethical dilemmas that require either a deontological choice or a utilitarian ethical choice. Deontological principles, ethical, I can do some trade-offs here and make a decision. So here are the stimuli I used. And there's a third one called the loop, and that one's very similar to this one. I put only these two because they're the main ones I'll be talking about. So here's the scenario. You are the person taking the experiment, a student or a subject, and you see yourself as this person. And you're walking along near some train tracks, which we all do all the time, right? And you see a train, and the train is a runaway train or a trolley. It's a runaway train, and it's going to kill 5 people, unless you move the switch. But if you move the switch, the train now goes to the other track, still kills 1 person. So, should you turn the switch? Is the question. Yes or no is the answer. So, if you don't touch the switch at all, your argument can be to yourself that I did not hurt anyone, I didn't harm anyone, I didn't cause harm to anyone. And that would be a deontological choice. But if you touch the switch, you are actually causing something different to happen. In this case, killing 1 person. But you save 5. So what do? That's the basic question. This is why this has been used quite a bit. Now, the footbridge, very similar scenario here. So we have, should you push the man? Answer is yes or no. In this case, you, the participant, are asked to see yourself as this person behind a large man. If you push the large man from the bridge, he'll fall over, stop the train, the runaway trolley, and again, you'll save 5 people or kill 1. Now, you can probably see, if you haven't seen this before, how this plays out. I mean, if you move a switch versus pushing a man, it feels very different already. And that's what some of these studies, a lot of these studies have shown, that people kind of behave differently. But these are the basic 2 stimuli I used for this experiment. So, should you push the man? Should you turn the switch? Yes or no in both cases. So here's my hypothesis. L2 speakers will make more utilitarian decisions than L1 speakers in all of the scenarios. There are 3 scenarios. I'm going to talk about 2 of them the most. So L2 speakers make more utilitarian choices than L1 speakers, and this is based on some previous work, mostly by Costa and some other people in Spain, 2014. And they explained it in this way, that if you're a second language speaker using your non-native language, you have less emotional attachment. So if you have less emotional attachment, you're more willing to make the choice that's more utilitarian. That was their explanation for their findings. I really assumed here at University of Arizona, second language speakers would have a very similar type responses. And so that was my hypothesis. And here's the first experiment, trolley number 1. So this is all in English. So in the switch scenario, first language speakers switched 87% of the time, or 88% of the time. Second language speakers switched 72% of the time. Both of these are high percentages, but the difference between the first language speakers and the second language speakers is here, you see the p-values significantly different. The loop, there were no differences. And what we can see here is we had 83 and 195 people participate in this one. In this loop, because it was only done once, I did 2 versions of this, or 2 runs of this experiment. I only had 123 subjects. In the footbridge, once again, I had significant differences. First language speakers were much more likely to push the man from the bridge than second language speakers. And again, the p-value shows that it's significant. Now, this is really interesting. So there are significant differences, just like there were with the Costa study, but my differences are completely the opposite. First language speakers are more likely to make the utilitarian choice versus second language speakers. So I did a second experiment, and this is in Chinese. Again, had everything translated into Chinese. The only parts I'm really going to be talking about are this part here. I don't think you can see it on the screen, but this is actually a little bit grayed out. So the data shows that Chinese speakers taking the experiment in Chinese in the United States had these percentages. Now, then I compared a similar population of Chinese students from experiment 1, and I saw how they did versus when a similar population of Chinese speakers did it in Chinese. And you can see there's basically no differences. And you see the p-values here are non-significant. So basically, whether it was Chinese or English, Chinese or English, Chinese or English, they basically gave the same responses, either pull the switch, push the man, or not. Now, the number up above is a different study, and it's from Alan Hughes and Tan Xiu, 2012, and they did a study with 1,000 Chinese speakers in China, in Chinese in China, and they found that the switch, loop, and footbridge were all lower than what I found. Now, the reason I put this up here, the three of them, this kind of works with like an interlanguage pragmatic studies where I think Casper, Bardovi, Harlig, some other people have looked at pragmatic awareness and grammatical awareness, those kind of things. So grammatical awareness is you're very aware of the grammar you're learning. Pragmatic awareness means you're very aware of maybe how people actually behave using the language, what's their idea of politeness and those kind of things. And what I found is that people, when they're in China, Chinese speakers in China, make very few utilitarian choices, or not few, but fewer than when Chinese speakers then move to the United States in Chinese, or when Chinese speakers are in the United States and participate in English. And I saw the same effect with the loop, 34, 68, 80. Footbridge, 22 to 34 here. These are very similar numbers. Now, the explanations for these things can be that this group of Chinese people can be very different than this group. So these folks maybe travel less, maybe they have less money, maybe they have less educational aspirations than these folks. So maybe there's explanations that go beyond this. But I saw these things together and I thought this is sort of a pragmatic type thing going on here, perhaps. The third experiment I did was in Spanish. So these are English speakers taking the test both in Spanish and English. And only numbers I'm worried about right now are at the very bottom here. So these are 36 native English speakers taking it in Spanish. And in the switch scenario, there was no differences. Here, there were differences. So this is what I found in experiment 1. When participating in someone's first language, they made many more utilitarian choices than when participating in the second language. Again, significant, and again, exactly the opposite of Costa. And here's Costa's numbers up here. So Costa found that when these are English speakers in Spain in English, in the switch scenario, both in English and in Spanish, very, very similar. And if you see, just in this column, pretty similar results. Where it's very different, this is where Costa said that second language speakers make more utilitarian choices, is in the footbridge option. So when using Spanish in Costa, the second language speakers were more likely to provide a utilitarian choice. Mine is the opposite. And I talked to Sean, and we have some explanations as to why that might be. It might be because I use the word should, and Costa used the word would. So that can make a difference, and I'm going to do a follow-up test to see if the should and would, in a follow-up test, make that big a difference, because that's really the only explanation why these results are so different. But it's still fascinating if would and should make that much of a difference between utilitarian choices. That has a lot of implications. I did one more study, and here I had English speakers participate both in English and in Chinese. English speakers participate both in English and Spanish, so 16 and 9, the same numbers as the previous study. And we see, in this case, non-significant differences, non-significant differences, non-significant, non-significant. So whether they're using Chinese or English and Spanish, they're basically giving the same choices as in either of those languages, which I thought was pretty cool. This is, like I said, repeated measures. They take it twice, 28 days apart. And then what I wanted to do is compare it again. So what I did is I took experiment 1, where there was Chinese speakers, and I took experiment 4. So this is the English version, and I compared those numbers. Nothing significantly different. Footbridge, no differences. Same thing when they did the Chinese version in experiment 2 and Chinese version in experiment 4. No differences. The p-values are very low. p-values are not low, but they're not significant for sure, and p-values that can are low. And then what I did is I took the lowest number and the highest number, and I thought, well, maybe those are significantly different. But again, they are not. So what this tells me is that speakers, no matter the language, are basically giving the same results. And this sort of indicates to me that maybe there's a first language or a cultural effect on decision making, no matter what. I did the same repeated measures design in Spanish, and same things. So when they took it in English versus when they took it in English in the first experiment or the fourth experiment, similar population, not the same people, no differences, footbridge, no differences. Same thing when they participated in Spanish. In experiment 3 and experiment 4, no differences, no differences. I took the high, the low, and the high and compared those. Again, no differences, whether they're speaking, whether they're doing this in Spanish or in English. So some of the results and implications, I think, are this. So I did find some significance in the switch and footbridge scenarios between first and second language speakers. L1 speakers made more utilitarian choices, but that was opposite the previous findings, mostly by Costa. Chinese and English speakers made significantly similar choices in two languages. And what I think it might be going on there is there might suggest an L1 effect on decision making, and I think there might just be a central tendency. So if this is your first language or this is your second language, there's a central tendency where there's some overlap going on, whether you're using one or the other. And if that's the case, if that's going on, and this is a fairly preliminary study still, there are some significance and so forth, that when someone goes to a new culture and a new language, even if they're very proficient, and most of these speakers are very proficient, they are making very similar decisions. And so that would be at least a language or maybe a culture, maybe both effect on decision making. So my third study is cognition. So cognition, people process things. So people process things and they make decisions. So I'll just leave this up here. A bat and a ball cost $1.10 total. The bat costs $1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? So the reason I did this cognition study, at the time I was doing this one, I was doing the other two studies in parallel, and I didn't really have the results. But I thought the verbal probability studies and the ethical decision-making studies were really heavy on language. And I thought, well, if I could remove a lot of the language from the studies, then I could see if there's any cognition things. So if there are only differences in those first two studies but not in the cognition, then I could say definitely there's a language effect. That's not really what I succeeded in doing, but that was my goal initially. And I did two studies here. One I'll talk about, one I will not. The first one is the subitizing experiment, which is like estimation. So subjects saw an array quickly. So an array had 1, 2, 3, 4 kind of objects up to 12. And then subjects had to say, I just saw very quickly from 0.5, so half a second to 2 seconds, objects of 1 to 3 objects, 4 to 6, 7 to 9, and so forth. What I found is that in time and in accuracy, first and second language speakers made significantly similar decisions, or they weren't very different at all. In the second study, participants answered a relatively easy problem that required only basic arithmetic to solve. Yet, previous studies, subjects usually choose an incorrect but a very compelling, intuitive answer. So two studies. I'm only doing the first one, cognitive reflection test. I had lots of subjects again, 381 altogether. Again, same sort of collection. So 381 subjects, 184 first language speakers, 197 second language speakers. Most of those were definitely Chinese. So my hypothesis is this. L2 speakers will provide more correct responses than L1 speakers in all three scenarios, and I'll show those in a second. And the reason I said that is because if you have System 1 and System 2 thinking, System 2 thinking is more reflective and slow. A lot of researchers have found that second language speakers have more reflective, slower thinking. But you need that type of thinking to solve the problems of the CRT, the cognitive reflection test. So I assume that would be the case. Hypothesis 2, men and women's scores on the CRTs will be similar to the findings by Frederick, 2005, and I'll talk about those also in a minute. So here are the three cognitive reflection scenarios. 1, a bat and a ball cost $1.10 total. The bat costs $1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? If you don't know the answer, if you do know the answer, you can wait. On the next slide, I'll give the answers. The second one, in a lake, there's a patch of lily pads. Every day, the patch doubles in size. If it takes 48 days for the patch to cover the entire lake, how long would it take for the patch to cover half of the lake? And you have to guess in days. If it takes 5 machines, 5 minutes to make 5 things, how long would it take 100 machines to make 100 things? And you have to guess. So here are the answers. The first one, the correct answer is 5 cents. Most people give the intuitive answer of 10 cents. The second one, most people give the answer of 24 days, but the correct answer is 47. The third one, most people give the answer of 100 minutes. The correct answer is 5 minutes. And so this is why the cognitive reflection test is very nice, because it teases out intuitive and reflective responses very quickly. So how do second language speakers do with that? A cognitive reflection test score, if you get 3 out of 3, you get a 3 answer of 3. If you get 0, you get 0 correct, and so forth. Scores from previous tests from University of Toledo, 0.57, MIT 2.18. People from MIT like to show off, I guess, but they actually do a lot better on this. So experiment number 1, this was a timed condition experiment, so people had only 10 to 35 seconds to choose the answer. A higher percentage of first language speakers provided an answer, either correct or incorrect, which is not really a surprise. A lot of other studies in eye tracking, for example, find that first language speakers are more likely to answer quicker, whatever it is, and second language speakers are a little bit slower. That's just sort of known. So that's not a surprise. But of all the participants to record a response, second language speakers were better. The problem with that is that it was not significant, but here are the scores. 0.28 to 0.20. These are very, very low compared to previous studies, but these were timed. Previous studies did not have a time condition. So that's experiment 1. Experiment 2, this is a non-time condition. The first one was a time condition, 10 to 35 seconds. This was a non-time condition. Once again, a higher percentage of L1 speakers provided answers. Excuse me, it's only in L1, the first experiment. In this one, a higher percentage of L1 speakers provided answers, correct or incorrect. A higher percentage of L2 speakers gave correct answers. In experiment number 2, a higher percentage of L2 speakers provided correct answers, again, but again, this difference was not significant. So we can see in this case, 0.83 versus 0.68, this 0.78 puts University of Arizona students, first and second language speakers, to like Michigan State student levels in a previous cognitive reflection test. I also looked at gender. So Frederick in 2005 found that males score higher than females on the cognitive reflection test, but women choose the intuitive but incorrect answer more often. Campiatelli and Gerons found similar results. A few others found results that weren't significant, but very much moving in the direction. So this was a replication of Frederick's findings and Campiatelli and Gerons' findings, or it's an attempt to see if this difference appears again in both cases. So do men score higher than women, and do women provide more intuitive answers than men on the test? So experiment 1, we see that men, in fact, do score higher than women, 0.37 to 0.05, which is definitely significant, and that's in the experiment 1, again, timed conditions. Intuitive answers, men and women were equal in experiment 1. So you can see their scores, and the way I created these scores is I just used the formula for the cognitive reflection test. So if they answered 3 out of 3, if they gave the intuitive answer in 3 out of 3 times, they got a score of 3, and so forth. So the average was 1.24 to 1.37, not significantly different for men and women in experiment 1 for the intuitive answer. The intuitive answer would be 10 cents for the bat and ball scenario. Experiment 2, men, again, scored higher than women, and it was significant. And this was the non-time condition. So men scored 1.0, females 0.55. That was significant. The intuitive answers for experiment 2, women actually did score significantly better than men, 2.29 versus 1.75 in experiment number 2, which is sort of interesting that that difference didn't appear here. But all these results together seem to fit previous research by Frederick and Campiatelli and Girons as well. So a couple of research questions that came out of this, these findings. So first of all, second language speakers do not score higher than L1 speakers on the cognitive reflection test. I mean, they're higher, but they're not significant, so there's nothing to report there. The gender scores do confirm Frederick and Campiatelli and Girons' findings. So men score higher and women are more intuitive, at least on one of the tests. What my question is from this is that what makes an L2 speaker fast enough to answer in time questions, yet slow enough to answer cognitive reflection tests questions correctly? So you have to be fast enough to answer in time, but then slow enough, in quotes, to still get it right. So that's just a research question. I don't have an answer for that. Second thing, if what Campiatelli and Girons found, if you have a mathematical, you have rational dispositions of the mind, or if you have this actively open-minded thinking, Baer in 2008, if those dispositions of the mind correlates to higher CRT scores, could L1 and L2 speakers improve their scores? So this is basically a standardized test question. So you want to do well in the GMAT or the GRE, but you're not very good at math. Can you actually improve your scores or not with a disposition of the mind? In this case, the disposition of the mind would be actively open-minded thinking, or could you improve in some way your mathematical and rational? According to the information I came across, the only one that's really variable is this actively open-minded thinking. Another question that I have is that in both experiments, males answered more questions correctly. Females' intuitive answers, however, were found only in the non-timed experiment. So my question from that is that do intuitive answers need sufficient time to develop? So even though we say it's intuition, we think of it as very fast. Maybe it also needs time to develop. So why would I find it in one condition that women provided more intuitive scores than men, but not in the other? So that was sort of what prompted this question. So conclusion, the end. I still have things after this, but this is sort of the end. So no, don't go quite yet. You have a few more minutes. So first of all, I think my overall results would say are very inconsistent or non-consistent findings among the studies. So perhaps you could say there are very few differences between first and second language speakers when they make decisions. And if that's the case, then maybe all people really need to do, let's say public policy people, are to provide well-translated materials for people to make decisions. So if they're making decisions very similarly, whether they're using their first or second language, and they have good materials to work with, translated, then maybe they're going to make very similar decisions. So maybe that's all that policy people really need to worry about is well-translated materials because they're making very similar decisions. Perhaps university administrators can be confident that students behave similarly. But as any second language speaker knows, or any teacher of second language speakers know, L2 speakers need to improve speaking, writing, and pragmatic competency before entering college. Often all those things are very, very low before they even begin college. Second language speakers also deal with a myriad of cultural and adaptation processes and pressures that my research doesn't address. So I'm certainly not saying that there's no differences, but some of my findings, one interpretation of my findings in the whole is that these findings are not really that different. They're non-consistent findings. On the other hand, perhaps finding small differences between first and second language speakers is striking. Maybe that is really fascinating. For example, if a first language speaking doctor underprescribes a medication based on the word rare vis-a-vis a second language speaking doctor, then there could be important differential outcomes for patients. So that could be something really interesting and important. Going along with the hospital and doctor theme, hospital administrators could use this information to implement more accurate protocols to reflect a practice of decision making. So maybe they could use this information in a way that helps a hospital system or communication system. Hospital administrators could accept the differences between first and second language speakers, and maybe they'll assign second language speakers in positions where managing risk is essential, maybe thinking through ethical dilemmas, or maybe solving problems that require more logic than intuition. Maybe you can take advantage of second language speakers and say, these are things they bring to the table. Let's put them in positions where they can serve the organization and healthcare best, for example. Finally, hospital administrators could use the results to better train all medical professionals on decision-making tendencies and program some of these tendencies into algorithms that assist medical professionals and patient decision-making. So perhaps you can actually do some things with this to improve decision-making for first and second language patients and first and second language speaking doctors in, let's say, a hospital or healthcare type environment. Thank you to all the teachers and participants who made this possible. All of you were very incredible, so I really appreciate that. To all my academic and professional colleagues at University of Arizona and around the world, I took classes in 6 colleges, so I'm very happy that some of those people contributed to my success. To my committee members, to Massimo Piatelli Palmarini, Heidi Burrows, Janet Nickel, Mary Peterson, and all of my professors, I'll have to thank you individually. Finally, I'd like to thank my parents for the gift of life twice and once each. Some people in this room know that I've had 2 kidney transplants, and my way of thanking my parents for that is not to really thank them, because when you receive 2 life-saving organ transplants in your life, a thank you just isn't enough. So my way to thank them is to participate in the US Transplant Games or the World Transplant Games every year since I've had my 2nd transplant. And to date, I've won 27 medals at the US Transplant Games and 6 medals at the World Transplant Games. So that's my way of saying thank you to my parents. And doing my PhD is also a giant thank you. It's an act of thanks, because simply saying thank you really doesn't suffice. So obviously I want to thank my parents for their wonderful gifts. And with that, that's the end of my presentation. Thank you.